while we were doing this, and I got distracted. I stopped pressing
It was
buttons.
very fun. It was great. It was good.
Suddenly, I was like, "Oh, I'm supposed to be getting things ready for this." And we're live. Here we are.
Here we
YouTube
are.
is very like when you're live, you're just it. You don't get
Johnny on
a
the spot.
warning. Yep.
No.
Here you are. We're live.
And NASA gets countdowns. We got nothing. No blast. But
Okay.
how we are recording. Life is good. Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Welcome to the Folk Music Educator podcast. My name is Philip Kramer,
I'm Erin May Lewis.
and we are two folk music educators that teach fully online and hang out. And we've been friends for a long time, and we've been recording podcasts for a long time, and we're now finally publishing those podcasts we've been recording for a long time. And here we are.
Baby steps.
Baby steps indeed. And so we're trying a new format of doing kind of a live stream with YouTube and then throwing it out to the world. We're still kind of testing audio levels. So thank you for being patient with us, and we're excited. Let us know if you want us to turn something up, turn something down, turn something off, and we'll do the best that we can.
That's right. Learning as we go.
Learning as we go. And that
Yep.
kind of brings us to the thing we were talking about today. We tend to try to get coffee once a week that's not around this, so we can also do paperwork and talk about the direction that we want to go and all that. Um,
Vision.
Vision. And we were ended up talking a lot about, the malleability of genre and what it's like, how the communities of people they're kind of the ones that set the tone and the pace for how we interact with each other and use technology and interact with other genres of music and all that kind of stuff. And we're like, we should talk about this on Friday again. So,
Yeah,
yeah, we're going to talk about it a little bit
here we
today.
are. The conversation kind of began when I mentioned offhandedly that last weekend was the Playing Blues on the Mountain Dulcimer Day event. And Phil said, "Is that a thing?" I said, "Well, it's a very small thing. What's kind of interesting about the dulcimer community, because mountain dulcimers and hammer dulcimers both are rather uncommon, more niche instruments. There tend to be whole events focused on the instruments, which include dabbling a little bit in many different genres. So you would tend to probably have most um, information around old time music traditions, especially with the mountain dulcimer. The instrument comes from the Appalachian Mountains, is closely associated with that like old time fiddle tunes and fiddle banjo, mountain dulcimer, old time
Yeah.
stuff gets closely connected for sure. But then you're also likely to have in the same single event a couple of classes that focus on Celtic music and some about bluegrass music, and you have like a folk singer songwritery kind of class, and you've got gospel music and hymns, and then you might have somebody who's like, here's a class on some rock and roll licks you can play on the mountain dulcimer, and then there's one about singing the blues, and it's all embedded in this one event. Whereas, like, if you're a guitar player, you're probably going to pick a genre and you're going to study that genre. And you would go to like a bluegrass guitar camp, or you would go to a bluegrass camp. And at the bluegrass camp, you could study guitar or mandolin or fiddle or banjo. But
Yeah.
it's embedded in a genre as opposed to the events being sort of built around the instrument and all the genres kind of being present. So it is kind of fascinating for me to kind of have like one foot in both worlds and see how often I think among dulcimer players we don't spend as much time learning the nuances of the genre.
Yeah.
Um and there can be a lack in that, I think, but at the same time we often are exposed to more different styles of music in the same place than you usually would be if you like go to a bluegrass festival.
That's a very interesting concept because I remember going to and hearing of different types of camps and festivals like Mandolin Symposium. I know Live Oak that is designed specifically more for the like instruments, and they do have that
Hmm.
genre kind of jumping around. And it one of the things that really seems to resonate with me about that is that concept of music being the universal language. Because we hear that
Yeah,
all the time. Oh, musicians can sit down, but while I agree to that to a certain point, like an American going to the UK, there's going to be more things than similar, but culturally speaking, we're using a kind of a different part of the lexicon, a different part of the
right.
glossary culture wise, and it's kind of a real big reflection of how while the tools that we are using are similar and how we use those tools and how there's a much bigger part of the cultural aspect of our music that things start to rely on. And I don't know, I find it fascinating to kind of consider those implications and how life works. And, with bluegrass, it's not necessarily a huge commercial undertaking, but, we do have these big festivals that we kind of consider are, crowning jewels throughout the country, like Telluride, Merlefest, all these things. If you get to play at these things, they're a rite of passage. And so there's still
Right.
kind of that dream and that goal of, performance, playing in a band, doing that kind of thing, playing at a festival like that. The cultural zeitgeist still has that kind of thing. In Tell me if I'm wrong, but is there an equivalent of that kind of performance performance in mountain dulcimer communities, or is it a lot more in tune with a much smaller community driven? I Am I making any sense?
Yeah, you are. And I think I would say that there definitely is sort of, I mean, there are some kind of hierarchies in the community, and there's some like, oh, I'm aspiring to get to this point, but it's a lot less performance driven, and it's actually a lot more instructional driven.
Yeah.
And so it's like to be hired as a teacher at a camp is, there's certain camps that if you get hired as a teacher at those, then it's like, oh, you've really made it. You're really
Yeah.
important here, and it has a lot less to do with performance. There have been a few, and I'm seeing it more among hammer dulcimer players than mountain dulcimer players right now, but there have been a few hammer dulcimer players who have said performing and recording, that's really what inspires me. And I actually don't enjoy teaching very much at all. And rather than trying to like rise to the top of the dulcimer community by teaching more, um they're kind of going on this path of trying to use the hammer dulcimer more as a performance vehicle or recording vehicle. And that does happen a little bit sometimes with the mountain dulcimer, but it is interesting that what I would describe as the kind of dulcimer community, or the industry, I guess you could call it, like the bluegrass
Yeah.
industry is very performance at a festival driven, and the dulcimer industry is a lot more teaching at a camp driven.
Yeah, like I went to the Pickin' in the Pines festival that happens in Flagstaff, Arizona, and it's a fun little fall time festival. It happened late September, early October,
Hmm.
and there was a lot of great performers, and I felt like I was was such a nerd in the sense that we show up, we listen to some music on Friday night, and then we go to Saturday, and I spent my whole day in the workshop tent getting to see like John Reichman and Jake Jolliffe,
Hmm.
um, just all these really great performers, doing workshops. And I'm just like, I hate to admit it, but I would love to have a festival that is essentially just like TED Talks for folk music. Just nothing but
Yeah.
workshops for several days. And
Uh-huh.
I think that would be an interesting concept. So I don't know. That's a very fun. I think one of the things that we as teachers and people who are kind of fostering the next generation of people living, like learning and being a part of the music. Not only if we're talking about little kiddos, but hey, I'm 40 years old and a banker and I found a banjo and I'm starting to learn. Like that
Yeah.
generation of people too is, what are the things that we want them to value about this, and how can we foster the things that we want to see more in our communities of, and
Yeah.
what should we be dreaming about, what should we, yeah.
I'm just thinking too about, in some ways I think that the bluegrass world has something really special and magical in the festival scene because it isn't just about performing.
Yeah.
It's not quite as educationally driven as like the dulcimer industry, but it's got that campground jamming thing that's a huge
Yeah.
part of the culture. It's got this like everybody gets together and they want to listen to their favorite bands, but they also want to sit and pick with their friends. And there's that communal music making thing about it. And I was just talking to a friend of mine about Cliff Top, which I've never gotten to go to, but it's definitely on the list of places I'm going to go someday. And I've been to the Galax Fiddlers Convention and these old time festivals, and they're really contest driven. Like the
Yeah.
entertainment is all contests. And the way Galax works anyway is you pay to get in, but if you enter a contest, you get your admission fee back. So they don't pay anyone to perform, but you don't have to pay for the event if you enter the contest, basically.
Interesting.
And so they've generated this culture around getting musicians to come for the competition. And then, of course, most of those musicians are going out into the campgrounds and they're playing old time music all night long. And so there's that kind of like communal music making that's a part of it. And I haven't done as many sort of folk festival things, but there's that similar like let's have a singer songwriter circle and we go around and we listen to each other's songs, and that seems like a thing. And again, I'm not deeply embedded in like country music and rock and roll or whatever, but it seems like most of your big country shows are like a big country show, and
Yeah.
you pay your ticket price and you get dressed up, and there's maybe sort of a after party vibe or something about it, but it's not so much about the audience participating in the music making process
Yeah.
as well. um and and I don't know if it's because bluegrass and folk music and old time music and dulcimer playing are far less commercialized, um, or if they'll never become commercialized because there's such a bigger influence on building the community around it. And when you build the community around it, then
Yeah. That's a
there's a lot less of just trying to sell the product.
very much a kind of chicken and the egg kind of question there.
Right.
I had a conversation about this recently with a friend, Caleb Edwards, out of Nashville. And I was like, okay, I have a hot take. And he goes, ooh, I'm excited. And to me, we were listing off who we thought the most influential bluegrass groups to the modern everyday culture of a bluegrass musician are, or like the bluegrass sound.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, at first glance, the things that I'm thinking of are like, going back to old Bill Monroe records, Kenny Baker, Flat and Scruggs,
Mm-hmm.
so on and
Mm-hmm.
so forth. But then we grow into the Sam Bush era and these
Mm-hmm.
second, third generation players and so on and so forth. But to me, the most impactful group is the Bluegrass Album Band. And with Tony
Uh-huh.
Rice, Doyle Lawson, J.D. Crowe, Bobby Hicks, and Todd Phillips. That's the main cast of players there. And the reason is that they are mostly playing standards. And if you listen to all of those players, they kind of set the archetype for what you grow to expect to hear players will sound like at a bluegrass jam. You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. Like if you're going and you're walking around, you listen to these albums, you're like, okay, this if you want to know what your role is in a community level in a how to not be a jam buster, how to be a good etiquette, how
Yeah.
to be all those things. And they set the tone of like what how solos are supposed to sound, all that kind of stuff. And it made me
Mm-hmm.
realize that there is a disconnect between the festival grounds and what's happening on stage. And you know, when you're a per stage performer, you're trying to make yourself sound as different as possible from like not as different as possible, but you're trying to create your own sound.
Differentiate in some
Yeah,
way. Yeah.
differentiate versus out there you might be trying to play standards or doing things, and I think that's I think one of the reasons is that so many the commercial version of music will never the reflection won't always be a perfect match to what the community or cultural version is of that music because like and I don't know if the big pop things or anything will ever really try to we won't I don't know if we'll ever get to see that murky reflection of what the actual cultural thing of the musicians playing that is. I think
Mm-hmm.
you'll be closer to at open mic nights or at cover like
Mm-hmm.
bars.
Mm-hmm.
You'll be able to hear that those old country classics more at a place like that. You'll see a closer cultural relay connection.
Yeah. I mean, that leads me to the qu question of like, how do new pieces of music become standardized, right? How do they
Yeah,
become standards? And there is something about it, the tunes, the melodies, the chord progressions being accessible enough that an average musician can interpret them.
yeah.
And when I think about like Bela Fleck's newest bluegrass album, I listened to it several times and it's great. And I also was like, I don't know if there's a single tune on here that follows a simple enough form that it could ever become a jam tune. But I think about like one of my favorite albums for a long time has been by Brian Sutton's Not Too Far from the Tree, I think it's called album.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just guitar solo.
Yeah.
And it's a lot of standards. But it's these like really incredible variations on standards. And then a few you've never heard. Or a few that he wrote, but they're still following a form that's like simple enough that you think, yeah, I think I could learn this tune, as opposed to this is like a 7-part tune. It modulates in the middle, and there's a section where it goes to 7/8 time. And it's like, well, that was really awesome. And the rest of us are never gonna be able to copy that. We're just not gonna get there. And I even think about, like Tony Rice's Manzanita album.
Yeah.
The tunes on there are hard, but they're just accessible enough that there's a group of us who are like, if I spend the next whole year working on how to play Manzanita or how to play Tipper, we could actually jam on this tune. It's in 4/4 time and it's just got an A part and a B part. Like it's complicated enough to make it really interesting. It's simple enough that you feel like I could play that.
Yeah, and I think one of my favorite books is called The Record of the Spaceborne Few. And it's a science fiction book, but it's really reflects a lot of the ideas of technology and culture and all these things. But there's this one of the characters is thinking about leaving home, and they're very afraid of telling their dad that they're about to leave home. And they're afraid that he is going to put his foot down and scream and holler. And when they end up talking to them, they realize he's like, no, like you're leaving for the right reasons and you're going to be taking our values with us. And he goes, for every person that needs to go and needs to explore, there need to be people that stay and hold on to the tradition and stuff as well. And so
Hmm.
I think a lot of the time in these folk music spaces, we can create an us versus them kind of approach of like, oh, I'm
Hmm.
maintaining a traditional space. It's important to maintain this, or it's
Hmm.
important for us to grow and do all these things. And I think instead of in that kind of us versus them, it's of us and them kind of thing. I think
Right.
we
Right.
create a symbiotic push and pull. And the thing that I will say is about a lot of those artists that are pushing the thing, the artists that I think are my favorites are the ones that routinely make things that feel like a gift to either side of the aisle.
Uh-huh.
One of my favorite, "Witching Hour" by Andrew Marlin,
Okay. Uh-huh.
is an album, one of my favorites, and it feels like a progressive, like old time album that is just almost entirely original tunes. I think it's all original tunes that feel like they could become old time jam standards. And some of my
Hmm.
favorite tune, like I have students that learn that whole album front to back, and
Wow. Yeah.
it's great. And Brian Sutton's a great example of someone who does participate in those genre bending, genre breaking, like progressive spaces, but also
Right.
makes albums that are gifts to the original communities that he was a part of.
Uh-huh.
And
I like that way of thinking about it. That was something that was actually in the conversations in the pubs in Scotland,
really,
which was kind of interesting. But I'm thinking, wow, that's, it sounds exactly because a lot of the current players are writing new tunes, and
yeah.
they're talking about how do we honor the traditions, and also how do we keep exploring and finding new sounds. And there were several times in the pub that I went to regularly where one of the musicians would say, "Hey, here's a tune I've been working on writing. Would you test it out?" And they'd pass around the music, and everybody would try to kind of play this new tune and then say, does it feel like it's playable and we could pick it up and it could become part of, could it go in a set with a couple of the traditional tunes?
Yeah.
And also because they don't tend to play only one tune at a time, they do these long medleys, right?
Yeah.
And I just thought it was really cool to be kind of in on some of those conversations and to recognize them as being the same exact conversation we're having in every other sphere of traditional music, which is how do we respect and value and preserve the traditions that have been handed down from generation to generation and to generation, and how do we have our own creative expression, and do we create something new and build upon what has been passed down and not let it just like become stagnant or be a thing that's only about looking back and not about also looking forward. And
Oh, I love that. And I think that's, yeah. And in a lot of ways that I think we are particularly well suited for it already, to have these conversations. And uh I'm sorry, I'm kind of just like basking in that great little point that you made. And it's really lovely.
We were talking a little bit about technology and not to like open up a whole other part of the
But I
conversation as we're kind of winding down the conversation, but I think it's valuable to also name that a
well,
part of a part of what's happening right now is the use of technology, and that like in some ways this little bitty dulcimer community has so fully embraced using technology as a way of gathering because we are so geographically separated, and things
yeah.
like that blues dulcimer day event could only ever be successful in a way that doesn't require everyone to be in the same geographic location, because we literally had people from coast to coast who were
Yeah.
participating in it and interested in the blues, but there would never be enough to be like, all right, let's have a blues on Mountain Dulcimer event in Kentucky and one in Florida and one in Idaho and one in California, you know?
No, you nailed it. And like and it's not there's precedent for musicians like us that have been um, pushing the envelope of technology and using it in unique ways for close to a century now. If like we keep going back, before all of this, there were people like Happy Traum with the Homespun Video Company.
Yeah,
Um, like
right.
I learned how to play mandolin watching the Chris Thiele and the Sam Bush and David Grisman resources made by Homespun. They're still around, and I
Hmm.
love that. I would love to interview you, Happy Traum. By the way, if you ever watch this. But even before that, we look
Yes.
at trad musicians making the ABC notations. Like for anyone who hasn't gone down that
Right.
rabbit hole, they made an entire computer language that helped transfer. Like so, you could be in England, send an email to your friend in San Francisco of the fiddle tune, and they could use that computer language to write their own sheet music
Yeah.
of the
They
tune.
used ABCDEFG on the computer keyboard instead of standard notation.
And it worked perfectly. And
Yeah,
you know,
it
you
still
keep
is used.
it's still used, and you keep
Yeah.
going further back, and then you can talk about the Sears and Roebuck's catalogs on how you could order banjos and fiddles and guitars and have them shipped to your house, so you didn't have to like there's so many banjos, like there's so many stories of people that's how they got their first instruments for our
Right.
grandparents and great grandparents generations.
Hmm.
And
Yeah, my dad has a Sears and Roebuck's dobro that he like it got passed
no
down to him, but there's
way.
no name on the instrument, and it turns out that it was a Sears and Roebuck instrument.
That's so cool. And
Yeah.
so I guess one of the things that if there was going to be a moral that talks about all of these things here, if you allow me to be poetic and
Yes.
all of these things here, is that I think our gut in for a lot of us, the reason we fall in love with these genres are things that we typically associate to be antithetical with technology and
Mm,
consumerism and commercialism.
right. It's the like sitting on your back porch.
Exactly. And I think one of the in the I feel like we're always going to be having that balance between
Hmm.
pushing to the next thing but also maintaining. And I think there's times where you'll jump back and forth, and you'll have artists that you just like really love what they do at one time and then not necessarily resonate with others. And Chris Thiele, I love you. Sometimes I love what you do, and sometimes I have no idea what the heck you're doing.
Uh-huh. I can relate. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think at the end of the day, when we go into a festival grounds, we're going to be finding people who, when you go to these workshops, you go to these camps or the festivals, you'll find people who are there for the first time. You find people that have been here for 20 years and got married at one of the festivals. you, you'll find people who are they can't play a lick, but you'll find out they're the main luthier of a small batch like specialty mandolin shop and make mandolins that are cheaper, that are more expensive than your latest car purchase. It's a symbiotic relationship that really needs everyone everyone's kind of values and opinions, and I hate to admit it, our dollars to kind of keep us going. And
Mm-hmm.
I think giving ourselves all the space to approach it the way that we need to approach it, and trying to foster that kind of deep respect and love and value for everyone is going to be a very important thing going forward,
Yeah.
especially as these spaces continue to build more and more infrastructure online. Take the
Right.
values you have that you got and bring them into the new spaces.
Right.
And
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, and using our online spaces as tools for ex being expansive and sharing and not restrictive. That's I always feel like when people ask me like how do you define a genre? How do you determine if it is this or it isn't this or whatever? Like how do you whatever? And I always think for me, I always want to take the expansive view. Like, how are we going to have a definition that is rich enough to hold the beauty of the starting place and the expansion into whatever is new? And that's how I feel about technology, is like it's never going to replace or be the same as pre-technology life. And if we can have this expansive view of it, just keeps enriching our communities, it keeps enriching the music and our lives. That expansive view feels right to me.
I agree. And I don't think it's possible for, at any point, a new branch of a genre will get so big that it changes the very nature of the tree that it grew from. You know,
Uh-huh.
like "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou" arguably is one of the most important things to happen to folk music in 20, 30, 40, 50 years. In a lot For a lot of people, that's how my parents came into this interest, and then how I got here. I have no idea about you, but like, it was important and it brought a lot of people into it, but it didn't
Yeah.
change the rest of the branches of the history.
Right. Right.
There was still Sam Bush and Flatt and Scruggs and the Bluegrass Music Album and all those guys outside of that movie and outside of that.
And I think that every time there's that like new branch, it's going to reach some other people. And when they discover that branch, they're going to then begin to explore everything that came before it too. I mean,
Yes.
my introduction to old time music, which is so funny because I've played the mountain dulcimer for a long time, right?
Yeah.
But I didn't know about old time music traditions. I knew about bluegrass. And so I was like taking my dulcimer to bluegrass festivals and trying to figure out what to do. And David Schnaufer was like my influence, and he was playing in a country band. So I didn't know about old time, right? But we
Yeah.
were at Rocky Grass, and the Freight Hoppers, who were more of an old time string band from North Carolina, they were playing at Rocky Grass that year, and no one there had ever heard of them. They were the like new band that no one knows about. And they hit the stage and they started playing this old time string band music, and everybody just went crazy. And we all became huge Freight Hopper fans. Well, then you start to learn that they are bringing forward this old, long time existing tradition. And, years later, I went and sat on one of the band members of the Freight Hoppers' front porch as he sat and just said, like, here's a collection of Library of Congress source recordings. If any of these tunes are interesting to you, I'll play them for you. This is the traditional music from this place. Like, I'll help you learn some of this old time music. But had it not been for the old time string band coming to a bluegrass festival, which is, there again, there was all the like, that's not old time music by the traditional players. But that's how I found it, because there was this little off branch and it led me to explore the rest of it. And so I think that anytime we're like, oh no, this new branch is going to be bad for it, we're forgetting that like people don't find the first branch sometimes. They find that new branch and then it leads them back to that.
And it's so funny when you listen. I completely agree with you. And like if you listen back to a lot of folks talking about flat like Bill Monroe and Earl Scruggs and all these guys, they start referencing the people back home in their original communities, you know,
Right.
that were
Right.
impactful to them. And
Right. You get things like Uncle Pen in Bill Monroe's songs, right?
yeah,
It was a real
exactly.
guy.
And you hear like some of the history they talk about with like Earl Scruggs was not one of the only people that was doing the three finger style back in his hometown. He was by far the most prolific in the sense that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's whatever is old will be new again, and so on and so forth. And it's just an
I find it
exciting
all
time.
deeply fascinating.
It really is. And I never want to look at, I never want to, how do I put it? Something can, there are things that can be sacred, and then there are things that are, cannot. Like, it's like, we either all belong to the tradition or we don't. You know, there's like, it's, I don't know. It's a fun cultural aspect of all this, and we're all just monkeys trying to figure it out, man.
Yeah. And I
Yeah,
lean toward all of it's sacred and we're all a part of it.
yeah,
And I think that's special.
it's great. So,
Mhm.
friends, I know this might have been kind of a rambly one. I don't
A
know how we
rambling
lit,
one.
but we had I certainly had a lot of fun making a podcast with you today, Aaron friend.
Likewise. Very
And
much so. Yeah.
and if you want to find out more of us, you can find me at Fiddle and Phil on Instagram and Fiddle and Phil Kramer on my website. And we are also on the Folk Music Educator podcast, and we'll have a website again here soon in the future, I think.
Right. It's
Yeah.
it's in the works.
How about you, Aaron? Where can we find you?
And I'm at Erin May Music. Everything is Erin May Music, erinmaymusic.com, at Erin May Music on all the places. So,
And we have a saying here that I think today is even more relevant than ever of always a student.
and always a teacher.
And thank you so much for listening to us, and you can find us wherever you find your podcasts. Have a good day.
Sweet. Bye.
Bye.